So the Las Vegas Raiders are in a very interesting spot as they head into the offseason after this final game coming up against the Chargers this Sunday. The Raiders are in an interesting spot specifically because they have $108 million in cap space. And we're not that bad of a football team. In fact, I think we have a top 5 defense if it's healthy. And if we're able to just fix a couple of key positions on the offense side of the football, I think we can actually compete. If you get a wide receiver 1, you fix that offensive line, and you add a quarterback that's a competent quarterback, you can win 9, 10, 11 games if you're the Las Vegas Raiders. Obviously, health will be a big part of it. But I want to talk today about 2 things that people have been talking about a lot. 2 guys specifically that a lot of Raider Nation has been talking about. These are 2 guys that are going to be free agents. Both guys are likely not going to be with the team that they're currently with. The first is going to be guard Trey Smith, who plays for the Kansas City Chiefs. Second is going to be wide receiver T. Higgins, who plays for the Cincinnati Bengals. And I want to talk about both of these guys and why I think it does not make sense for the Raiders to bring both of these guys in. Now, I'll be the first to tell you guys, I love T. Higgins. And I think for the Raiders, if you do bring in T. Higgins, there's definitely a ton of upside with that, especially if you pair him up with a good quarterback, right? T. Higgins is that wide receiver 1, but we'll talk about why it might not make sense here in a second. But I want to talk about Trey Smith first. You guys know that I love offensive linemen. It's something that I do pretty much every single day is watch other teams' offensive linemen. Of course, I watch the Raiders. That happens Monday morning. It's the first thing I do right after that game. But over the course of the week, we get into other teams as well, right? So there's a lot of guards in the NFL that I pretty much check in on, if not weekly, every other week. Guys like Samuel Cosmi, Kevin Dotson, Landon Dickerson, Robert Hunt, Damian Lewis. The list just goes on and on with guys that I've evaluated coming out of college, guys that I still kind of keep an eye on, to be able to better understand guys that have success versus guys that don't. And Trey Smith's a guy that I really, really like. And Trey Smith, was not a first or a second round pick. This guy was like a 5th round pick. The Chiefs got Trey Smith because of partly due to an injury. They weren't sure if he was going to be able to play as he kind of got into the NFL. And Trey Smith has been one of the most dominant offensive linemen, but I do think if you're the Las Vegas Raiders, you have $108 million. You have some flexibility. I do think signing a guard to that type of contract does not make the most sense. I don't think it's the best value the Raiders can spend that money. Trey Smith's not going to get $5 or $6 million. This guy's looking at somewhere near $20 million a year. That's kind of where Trey Smith's value is. Now, it might not be exactly 20, but it's going to be north of $17 million. To me, that doesn't make sense to pay a guard that type of money. Now, I understand Trey Smith's one of the best guards in the NFL, but you can find one of the best guards fairly easy, at least in my opinion, right? I think guard's a position where if you put the investment into it, you can find a really, really good guard. Just a couple of recent examples. The Raiders drafted Jackson Powers-Johnson in the 2nd round. Jackson Powers-Johnson's arguably the 2nd best center already in the NFL. If he plays guard full-time and he's a guard for the next 5 years, within a year or 2, he'll be a top 5 guard, right? Jackson Powers-Johnson, the guy you can analyze, watch him in college. You just know this guy's going to be a great football player as he gets into the NFL. And there's a lot of guys like that every single year that come out, right? They're guys that we know these guys are going to be good football players. Cooper Beebe, Dallas Cowboys. He actually played center for him, but he was a guard mostly in college. Really, really, really good football player. We knew this guy's going to be a top 5 guy at that position. He's playing center, and he's going to be a top 5 center at some point as well. Really good football player. Finding guys like that is fairly easy in my opinion. Right, and I think spending, close to $20 million on a guard isn't the best value. You could look at positions that really impact winning and losing. Obviously, the quarterback's at the top of the list. Right after quarterback, it's probably like wide receiver. Maybe it's your offensive tackle. At the very, very bottom, you're going to get positions like running backs, positions like guard. You'll get a position, even like a tight end, I think is on the lesser important side than quarterback and wide receiver. Although if you have Brock Bowers, a little bit different because he's kind of a wide receiver. But the general tight end's not that important, right? You look at a guy that gets picked in like the 3rd round, right? Doesn't really have an impact if it's a tight end, right? I think for the Raiders, you got to really consider how you spend that money that you have. And I think Trey Smith would be bad value. If you have Tyler Smith and you draft Tyler Smith, you get 5 years out of the best guard in the NFL, right? The Dallas Cowboys drafted him in the 1st round. 5 really, really, really impressive years. Then you'll extend him. He'll probably be like 25, 26. You'll get another 5 years out of him. That makes sense to pay a guy if you kind of bring him in. Also, don't overlook the fact that just because one guy works in one scheme and system, in one situation specifically, right, doesn't mean it's going to work in every scheme and system in every situation, right? You go to a new team, things kind of change. You go to a new city, things kind of change. Not saying I don't think Trey Smith will still be a top 10 guard in the NFL if he came to the Raiders. I just don't think it's great value for the Raiders. Let's talk about T. Higgins a little bit, because T. Higgins is a guy that I actually really do like for the Raiders. And I'd be 100% in on T. Higgins. But we do have to realize that T. Higgins is going to end up getting $30 million. And if you're going to pay T. Higgins $30 million, you have to realize that you're going to lose out on some other guys. And let's talk about it a little bit. At the end of this year, the Las Vegas Raiders have 27 pending free agents. So although we have $108 million, we have that because basically half our team is empty at this point, right? And if you just look at the list of guys that are free agents, there's some big names on this list, right? You got guys like Robert Spillane, Trayvon Merrick, Nate Hobbs, Adam Butler, right? If the Raiders want to bring these guys back in, you got to consider that these guys are going to end up getting essentially paid relative to where, positional value, of course, but some of these guys are like top 5 to 10 guys at their position. Nate Hobbs is a top 10 slot corner. Trayvon Merrick is a top 10 safety. Robert Spillane is a top 10 linebacker. Adam Butler, I would say, is a top 10 defensive lineman. Although he's on the older side, I think he's going to get cashed out this offseason. Butler can easily make $8 to $10 million a year this offseason. Trayvon Merrick can get like $12 million. Hobbs can get like $12 million. Malcolm Koonce is another guy the Raiders will have to really think about. Malcolm Koonce, had he gotten paid after last season, he would have gotten like $18 to $20 million. He would have gotten a very similar contract to what Jonathan Grenard got. Remember, Grenard went from the Houston Texans, where he had a monster year for 1 year, right? He really broke out that 1 year, went to the Vikings. The Vikings gave him like $18 million a year. And this year, Jonathan Grenard is one of the best pass rushers in the NFL, right? He's a phenomenal football player for the Vikings. And I think Malcolm Koonce is going to kind of fit that same mold. Now, obviously, he did have an ACL injury, so he might end up getting less than $18 million, but he's not going to take like $3 or $4 million. It's not happening, right? For as good as Malcolm Koonce was in 2023 that we all saw, right? We all watched him dominate. So did every other 31 NFL teams, right? These guys all have directors of player personnels. These guys have scouts that are analyzing other teams' guys. Malcolm Koonce, if the Raiders say we'll give you $5 million, will go and sign for 10 with pretty much any other team. Every team out there will say, we'll take Malcolm Koonce. So if the Raiders want to keep this guy around, they're going to have to pay him at least like $10 million. And I think, even that could be on the shorter side. Obviously, he's coming back from injury. I think a 1-year contract makes the most sense for him. He can kind of get right, potentially prove himself, and then get that contract the following year. But if the Raiders want to keep Malcolm Koonce, that's like $10 to $12 million. Clavon Chasen, right? If you want to keep this guy, I don't really know what his value is. I would say it's less than Malcolm Koonce, but maybe he wants like $6 to $8 million. Isaiah Paul-Amal, right, is another guy. So, just kind of thinking about those 7 or 8 guys right there that I would put obviously at the top of the list. These are all starters for the Raiders. You're right away looking at like $60 million among those 7 guys. And again, that's on the more conservative approach, right? And let's say you spend 60, 65 million on some of these guys. Well, 7 or 8 guys off of this 27 list means you still have 20 other roster positions you have to fill, even at the league minimum, right? Like the vet minimum of $2 to $3 million. If you have 20 positions to fill at $2.5 million, think about that. That's like $50 million that you have to potentially spend, right? So that $108 million is really not a whole lot when you consider the fact that there's a lot of roster spots that you ultimately have to fill. There's some pending free agent key guys, especially for the Raiders. So you got to realistically consider that there's actually not as much money as you might think that the Raiders actually have. So spending $20 million on Trey Smith, $30 million on T. Higgins is probably out of the question, unless you want to lose guys like Adam Butler and Malcolm Koonce and Robert Spillane and Trayvon Merrick. And I know some of those guys are replaceable. Like you can replace Robert Spillane, truth be told. Linebackers are mostly scheme specific anyway, so you can probably replace Robert Spillane. You can probably replace Trayvon Merrick and Nate Hobbs. But I think Trayvon Merrick's best football is in front of him. Same with Nate Hobbs. I think both of those guys are guys that have really developed into Patrick Graham. I think those 2 guys have a lot of value for the Raiders, more value than Robert Spillane. Adam Butler, I think he's a top 5 to 7 pass rushing defensive tackle. I think he's another guy you want to keep. He hasn't really ever had a big contract, right? I think he's getting like $2 to $3 million this year. Butler could easily get 8 to 10 on the open market. I was surprised he didn't get that last year, to be honest. I think his value is much higher than some other guys that we've had in the past, right? So I would love for the Raiders to get T. Higgins. I don't think it's realistic. Same with Trey Smith. I think Trey Smith would just be bad value. I think T. Higgins would be good value, but it's hard to pay someone $30 million. And some people are going to say T. Higgins isn't going to get 30. He'll get like 20. I think people are off on that, right? Brandon Ayuk got 30 million. Amon St. Brown got 30 million. T. Higgins is just as good as those guys. And if you don't think he's as good as those guys, Jalen Waddle got 28 million, as did DJ Moore. T. Higgins is better than both of those guys. Plus, T. Higgins is a true X wide receiver. You know, there's not a lot of X wide receivers, right? There's really not a lot of guys that can beat double coverage, that can play the X, can run block the way T. Higgins can. You can go out and draft a guy like Tetra McMillan, who's like 6'4", 6'5". He's a true X wide receiver as well, but that means you're going to have to spend the 7th or 8th overall pick on him. I'm not opposed to that. I think that could also make a lot of sense for the Raiders. Draft the wide receiver 1, roll it back with Aiden O'Connell if you want, or you go out and get Jalen Monroe, who just declared for the NFL draft, maybe in the 2nd or 3rd round. But the Raiders are going to have to figure it out as we kind of go into the offseason, right? I would just question how much money we're spending on other teams' free agents as opposed to the homegrown guys that have proven to be good football players. Right? Our defense is a top 5 defense if it's healthy. Last year, we're top 10, and I think even this year, we've been a really good defense if you don't consider the fact that our offense has given up a ton of points, right? The offense has turned the ball over like a crazy amount this year, which has led to easy points. I think if the Raiders wanted to, go with the approach of keeping your homegrown talent, I think it just kind of makes the most sense. Now, talking about homegrown talent, there's a guy that is an absolute stud for the Raiders, and that's going to be defensive coordinator Patrick Graham. And today at his presser, some interesting words were kind of had where a reporter actually said that Patrick Graham has done a great job, right? Patrick Graham, you as the defensive coordinator, you've done a great job for the Las Vegas Raiders. And Patrick Graham quickly jumped in and said, that is not true. We have not won. The Raiders do not deserve Patrick Graham, man. I'm telling you guys, Patrick Graham is one of the best defensive coordinators in the NFL. Patrick Graham, Brian Flores is the guy that gets a lot of credit. And the reason why Brian Flores gets credit is because the Vikings are winning. But the Vikings are winning because of the fact that they have a good quarterback, right? They have a good offensive coordinator, or at least a good head coach that calls their plays, right? The Raiders are not winning because of the fact that our offensive coordinators suck for most of the season, and we don't have a quarterback. But had we had a great offense coordinator and had we had a great quarterback and we were winning, people would also say that Patrick Graham's one of the best defensive coordinators. Now, we would have to be healthy, right? We would have had to have Malcolm Koonce. We would have had to have Christian Wilkins and Maxx Crosby healthy for the entire year. But I think what Patrick Graham has done for the Raiders this year has been phenomenal. And I think he is one of the best defensive coordinators in the NFL. If you know, when the Raiders brought this guy in years back from, I think he was with the New York Giants at that point. I remember reaching out to a guy that covers the New York Giants that's a friend of mine. And I remember talking to this guy and saying, hey, what are your thoughts on Patrick Graham? And he told me that, hey, everything we had heard of Patrick Graham coming in was this guy's one of the smartest football minds in all of football. The first year he had success, but this last year he wasn't as good. But people say he's a smart guy, and you can kind of see it that he's definitely smart, but the Giants just didn't have the personnel to have success. And when Patrick Graham came to the Raiders in the first year, I was like, he's kind of whatever. Defense isn't much better. But in year 2, and especially in this 3rd year, I've realized that Patrick Graham is legit. Right? He's very, very legit. Obviously, to have a good defense, your offense has to be consistent, can't turn the ball over and do those type of things. And to me, Patrick Graham's one of the best defensive coordinators. And I wouldn't be surprised if Patrick Graham actually gets head coaching opportunities this next cycle. In fact, the Raiders are apparently at risk of losing top coordinator Patrick Graham. And part of that is because he will have opportunities as a head coach. He had some interviews, I believe, last year. He didn't get the job. I think the Seahawks were one of the teams that interviewed him. The Seahawks went with Mike McDonald, who's with the Baltimore Ravens. But Patrick Graham, once again, will have more opportunities this next season, right? I think teams that need head coaches, if there's like 6 teams out there that need head coaches, only one's going to get Ben Johnson. And then every other team's going to be looking at guys like Patrick Graham and some of these other offensive coordinators that are having a lot of success, right? Like the Bucs have a really good one. Patrick Graham has a real shot to end up becoming a coordinator. Now, there's also another rumor that I kind of heard a couple days ago that I do want to just touch on a little bit. Patrick Graham did not sign an extension with the Raiders. Now, if you guys don't know this, if you're a offensive coach, if you're a defensive coach, if you're a head coach, your contracts are basically guaranteed. So once you sign 2 or 3 years, regardless of when you sign, right? Like if you sign a 3-year contract today, you get fired tomorrow, you're getting your 3 years, right? Contracts are guaranteed if you're a coach. And some people are saying, why would Patrick Graham not have, why would he have not signed a contract extension last year? Right, this is his final year with the Raiders, which Tom Pelissero put out there. Why would he have declined to sign an extension with the Raiders last year? And this is something that I've been thinking about. It's something I've had some conversations with people a lot smarter than me about. And some people think that there's a chance that Patrick Graham's going to go and take another job somewhere else. There's a chance that Patrick Graham may recognize that even if Antonio Pierce is kept for another year, if the situation's not right, if they don't have a quarterback that's winning, if they're not in a good spot, it doesn't make sense for Patrick Graham to stick behind only to be fired halfway into this next season. It would make more sense for Patrick Graham to say, hey, Ben Johnson just got the job with the Chicago Bears. Let me go pair up with Ben Johnson and let me go run that defense. That makes a lot of sense in my opinion, right? Because if he signed that contract, he wouldn't be able to get out of it, right? And the fact that he did not sign that contract, it means he can get out of it. It's the same way Vic Fangio left the Miami Dolphins to take the Philadelphia Eagles job. Right, it's the same exact way that he ultimately had a job under Mike McDaniels and realized that this isn't for me. I want to switch focus and go be the coach for the Eagles. The head coach has been there longer. It's a better structure. It just works for me better. People are saying Patrick Graham might actually take that same approach for the Raiders. I hope it does not happen, but it is possible, and I do think it's something to kind of think about because that means if AP is retained after this season and Patrick Graham leaves, that means you got to find not only a good defensive coordinator, but a good offensive coordinator. So you'll be looking for 2 different coordinator positions for the Raiders since Antonio Pierce does not call plays. We'll see what ends up happening, right? We'll just see what ends up happening. And then finally, let's just wrap this up. Brock Bowers, Maxx Crosby were named to the 2025 Pro Bowl games. Shout out to these 2 guys, man. No one deserves it more than Brock Bowers for the dominant season he's had as a tight end. The guy's basically leading all statistical categories for tight ends. He's leading for rookies, all the statistical categories. To me, I'd be shocked if Brock Bowers is not the offensive rookie of the year this year, right? Offensive player of the year. I guess is rookie of the year. I'd be shocked that he doesn't get that, right? Because the guy's had a dominant football season. And you don't generally get this type of year from this type of guy. Now, Malik Neighbors is also having a great season. Shout out to him for being the best wide receiver out of last year's class. Brock Bowers deserves it, in my opinion. The guy as a tight end with multiple quarterbacks is coming in and out, has had a phenomenal season. And, of course, Maxx Crosby. I think Brock Bowers was number 1 in votes, but Maxx Crosby for his position was number 5. So it's 4 other guys that people thought deserved it more than Maxx. I could agree with that. The fact that Maxx hasn't played for a couple of weeks either at this point. But up to the point, Maxx did have a really, really good year. So both of these guys are going to be in the Pro Bowl. If there's one guy I think the Raiders should have been able to make it, I think it'd be Robert Spillane. Spillane had a really good year from tackles, interceptions. On the defensive side, he's been a captain, a leader. Although I said the Raiders can potentially move off of him earlier, I still find the value in Robert Spillane. I would obviously want the Raiders to bring him back, but I think he's the one guy that kind of got snubbed. Maybe AJ Cole as well. I think the Raiders may have punted a little bit less this year because we had so many turnovers. Don't quote me on that, but I think those 2 guys probably deserved it a little bit as well. Jackson Powers-Johnson, I think, definitely deserved it as well. But we also got to recognize there's a lot of really, really good interior offensive linemen. I know Cam Jurgens made the first Pro Bowl as well. Jurgens, if you guys don't know, is a guy that I personally absolutely love. I think he came out of Nebraska or Wisconsin. He came out of one of those red schools. And as he came out, he actually went to the Eagles. He was a backup. Apparently, Jason Kelsey handpicked this guy and was like, that's the guy that has to replace me. And I loved him coming out of college, right? And he's made the Pro Bowl in his first year starting at center. The guy's a phenomenal player. I think Jackson Powers-Johnson is one of the top 2 or 3 centers. The only other guys that I would put up there right now is Cam Jurgens and Creed Humphrey. So there you guys have it. I think JPJ will probably make it next year, though. We'll see what ends up happening. Let me know what you guys think, man. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with another video.